We continue this morning's special coverage with two former astronauts, both of whom had close calls in space. Alan Bean, crew member aboard Apollo 12, was the fourth man to walk on the moon and the commander of Skylab 2. He also was in charge of basic training for 5 of those who were lost aboard the Challenger. He joins us now from the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And here in our New York studio, David Scott, a crewman aboard Gemini 8, Apollo 9, and commander of Apollo 15. He remains a leading authority on booster engines. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
First, I'd like to go to you, Alan, down in Houston. Tell us about your problem you had on the Skylab 2. That was quite a scare, wasn't it?
Well, we had a problem on Skylab 2 where we lost some thrusters during the rendezvous, and then it wasn't so scary as it was mystifying. When something goes wrong and lights light up, you sort of are concerned about what's happening and you don't really know for sure.
And on Apollo 12, you were hit by lightning, were you not?
Yes, that was even more amazing. I was sitting in the right seat, and this was about 50 seconds after launch. Lightning struck our spacecraft. We didn't know that at the time. The indication we got was about 15 warning lights coming on. And at that moment, there's a lot of noise, a lot of vibration, just like the shuttle during launch. And when those lights came on, it took me a good 5 seconds to finally convince myself that the lights were really on and we really had a problem. Of course, yesterday, they probably didn't have any warning lights, and they certainly didn't have 5 seconds to think about it.
David, you had a problem on Gemini 8, what your spacecraft was tumbling, the capsule.
Yes. Well, it was similar to what Alan said. It's a surprise. You see the indications, you take corrective action, and most of the time in flight it's almost automatic because of the intense training and the preparation that you have before you go.
David, you're an expert on the booster situation. All the attention now seems to be focused pretty much on that main fuel tank. Do you think that's where the problem was?
Well, it's hard to say, John. I think we can't speculate until NASA's had an opportunity to review all the data and reach a conclusion of its own. NASA's a very good detective. I think they'll be able to sift out the data, especially since we've had 24 successful flights and we know what's going on with the shuttle. And as a matter of fact, my company's developing a small upper stage booster rocket based on the shuttle technology, and we feel very comfortable that the shuttle and its technology is a very safe system.
Alan, as we mentioned at the beginning, you were in charge of helping to train 5 of the astronauts. You have some pretty special memories this morning, I would assume.
I certainly do. When I heard that the shuttle had a disaster, I, of course, turned in television and followed it, and then they showed the pictures on television of the crew members, and the 5 professional crew members were ones that were the first astronaut candidate class that we had back in 1978, and I trained most of them. I have good memories about all of them. One of my favorite remembrances was of Judy Resnick. We had taken all the candidates down to Key West to undergo some parachute training and some water training, and there were 50 people in this boat where we were teaching them how to survive in case they went in the water in their parachute. There was only about 15 astronauts. The rest were Navy and Air Force pilots. And one of the procedures was that you need to learn is the boat gets going about 20 knots and drops the person, in this case Judy Resnick, in the water, and she's being towed behind the boat, and you've got to figure a way to come up and not be swallowing water and turn over on your back and release your parachute harnesses. And that day, if you don't do it right, by the way, and I didn't do it right when I did it long years ago and had to do it again, on that vessel there were only 2 people out of the 50 that did it right the first time, and Judy Resnick was one of them. And so I had a fine memory that moment when that occurred, and I've thought about that many times, about women in space, and Judy Resnick particularly.
David, what does all this mean, this tragedy of yesterday, mean to the future of the space program? Big setback?
Well, I think it's a temporary setback. It is indeed a big setback. It's a tragedy. But I believe we'll proceed on. We'll be able to sift out the data, find the problem. And as you know, we're opening the frontiers of space. We're beginning to develop commerce. And I think the country is going in a very positive fashion. We just have to fall back, regroup, and then proceed on again.
Do you have any problem with the idea of moving toward civilians in space, as we did this time with a school teacher, talk now of a journalist, whenever the next shuttle flight might be?
Oh, no, I believe we have to do that, and I believe they want to do that. I believe Krista, a very intelligent woman, understood what she was doing, and she went out to the frontier. As I think she said in one of her interviews, if you don't play, you don't win.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us this morning. Next, we'll go to Washington to hear from two senators with a special interest in what happened to the Cape and in the future of the space program. First now, let's take a station break.
Two members of the U.S. Senate with special interest in the space program are with us this morning from our Washington studio. New Mexico Republican Pete Domenici is chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, and both he and Republican Jake Garn of Utah are on the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee that oversees NASA's budget. But perhaps Jake Garn is best known as the senator who took a shuttle flight in outer space in April of last year. Senator Garn, the personal was paramount for you on yesterday. Has 24 hours changed your perspective at all?
No, it hasn't, Jane. It's been an extremely sad time for me. Visiting with the families last night was very difficult because it's so impossible to feel adequate in what to say to comfort them. But I suppose the thing that was most touching was Mrs. Scobie standing up as the Vice President and Senator John Glenn and I walked into the room in the crew quarters at Cape Canaveral. She said, Mr. Vice President and Senators, I want you to know that I speak for all of the families. We want the space program to continue. Despite today's tragedy, we don't want it slowed down, we don't want it stopped, and we know that our loved ones would feel exactly the same way. So the program should continue. This is a great tragedy. It's a shame that it happened, but it should not deter us from our great exploration of space.
Should Mrs. Scobie be concerned that that might not happen?
Well, I don't think so. I think Congress is much more aware of the values of the space program and all of the spin-offs that help every human being on the face of this earth every day, and products and technologies that we have gained from space exploration. So I don't think that's going to happen. There will always be some naysayers and some negative people who would say that, but if we were going to stop this because of this accident, if you look back in the past in a lot of different scientific endeavors, we didn't stop them because we had some temporary setbacks.
Senator Domenici, I'm going to guess that the naysayers on Capitol Hill are a little underground at this point. Would it be unseemly to criticize NASA at this point in our national grief?
Oh, I'm sure they will be back above ground, as Senator Garn indicated. They're probably hid out for the time being. But, you know, there were naysayers even when we didn't have budget problems. There were people who thought we ought to do it another way. They didn't like manned space flights. They wanted to cut back on this program 8 or 9 years ago when I first got involved. So they'll still be around, but let me say there's nothing that makes American people more proud than when we accomplish great things, when we're on the cutting edge. And this has been a tragedy, but I think it may work in reverse. I think there may be more support rather than less for this magnificent program because of this tragedy.
Well, there may be some double meaning in that cutting edge phrase that you used. Budget cuts were inevitable, and now with the dollar loss in losing a quarter of the space shuttle program, the loss of the orbiter, the time that's going to be lost, you're going to give NASA more money than you had anticipated because of this loss?
Well, let me just put it this way. I'm positive that the United States Congress is going to find a way to continue this program. I can't give exact dollar figures at this moment, but I'm convinced that this is the kind of program that has so many benefits for mankind and for America as the world's leader in so many respects that we're going to see it through.
But would you take advantage of this tragic turning point to do some course correcting?
Well, frankly, I have always been one that listens to the experts and weighs the pros and cons. I don't try to put myself in their shoes. So I think we'll listen to them again, and perhaps some correcting has to be done. But from my standpoint, we had refined shuttle and reduced it to a minimum size for its effectiveness, and we ought to continue and see it through.
Senator Garn, what about you? Would there be any course correcting that you would take advantage of in this time of assessment or reassessment?
Well, Jane, I think we have to realize that we've had 25 years of space flight, 55 missions without an accident in the air at all. I think we need to look at the positive side and what a remarkably safe program this has been. The course correction that needs to be maintained or found out at this point and accomplished is we need to know exactly what caused this accident. And as soon as we have determined that and fixed what the problem was so that it won't happen again, then we will continue. So the course correction is a delay while we regroup, find out why this tragedy occurred, and then move on in this great exploration of space.
I'm going to ask you to make a guess, but in both of your cases, it's an educated guess. How soon will Americans be in space again?
Well, it's hard to guess because there's so little information available right now. It could be a matter of just a few weeks. It could be several months.
I agree.
All right. Senator Domenici, Senator Garn, thank you again. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And we'll be back after these messages. If you have never seen it, the launch of a space shuttle is frightening, it's thunderous, it's awe-inspiring to see when it turns out right. We're going to show you this split-screen version of the launch of the Columbia on January 12th, the successful launch. And next to it on the left is the launch yesterday, the disastrous launch of the Challenger. And they are set time to time.
Throttle down to 65% shortly.
Roger, we copy.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Engine still running smoothly at 85, now stepping down to 67% as the shock wave.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up. Dynamic pressure of the vehicle.
1 minute 15 seconds.
We're back at 8 o'clock on this somber Wednesday morning, the 29th of January, 1986. It has been only 25 years since the first man rocketed into outer space, a brief moment, really. But as President Reagan said yesterday, it has been a time of dazzling accomplishment that leaves us taking wonders for granted. Well, now suddenly there's been a tragic accounting and serious questions about how our space program should proceed, and we'll discuss some of those questions in this hour. And welcome back to our second hour of today and our special coverage of the Challenger tragedy. I'm Jane Pauley. Bryant Gumbel is on vacation this week. John Palmer has moved over from the news desk. John?
And Jane, later in this hour, we'll talk with a child psychologist with some advice for parents whose children are among those affected by the tragedy at the Cape. And Mike Leonard reports from Concord, New Hampshire, a little town this morning facing up to the painful fact that its favorite school teacher won't be coming back from her field trip to outer space.
But let's get the hour started at the news desk this morning. Bob Jameson.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning. Ships, planes, and helicopters are searching the Atlantic Ocean off the Florida coast this morning. They're searching for debris from the exploded Space Shuttle Challenger. Throughout the night, Coast Guard cutters and other vessels have been combing the area but have recovered little more than the thermal tiles that covered the shuttle. All debris recovered will be impounded and studied as experts try to determine what went wrong. There was no warning of trouble from any of the shuttle's computers or instruments, no signal that anything aboard was malfunctioning. So NASA experts are refusing to speculate this morning on what caused the explosion. Robert Bazell is in Houston this morning, where NASA officials are exploring many theories. Morning, Bob.
Good morning. One of the reasons that there was no indication beforehand of a disaster is that the computers that the NASA officials in the Launch Control Center and at Mission Control here in Houston look at during the launch and as the ship proceeds towards orbit are updated only every 1 second. That's the speed that the computer is able to display the information on the screen. And this is an important point because actually the data is stored in many areas in milliseconds. And what the engineers here and in several other areas around the country will begin to do today is to examine the data that came in from the spacecraft Challenger on a millisecond by millisecond basis, trying to find anything that was an indication of where something might have gone wrong. Now, we have a model here of the spacecraft. The shuttle itself, as we've said many times, we've been talking about this, sits on top of an external fuel tank and 2 solid rocket boosters. Everybody here knows that the external tank, which contains a mixture, a very explosive mixture of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, exploded. That's what caused the ultimate disaster. But nobody knows what the first event was that led to that explosion, and that's the crucial question. The solid rocket boosters themselves are full of a kind of fuel that does not explode, so that wasn't where the problem began. However, there are some explosive bolts there here and in several other areas that are designed to throw these off at 2 minutes and 5 seconds into the flight. One one theory. It's one of many theories, and their only theories is that these explosive bolts may have gone prematurely. Another theory, one that we've heard quite often, is that in the main shuttle engines, which are at the back of the orbiter right there, there are some fans, turbines that rotate very quickly. One theory is that a piece of metal in one of those main engines broke off, flew off into some place that ultimately led to the external tank to explode. Those are the things that the engineers will be looking for as they look at this millisecond by millisecond analysis of hundreds of different systems that they have recorded here on the ground and in other places, trying to find a clue as to what happened. It's not going to be an easy task. It's going to take quite some time. Bob?
Bob, thank you. Florida Democrat Don Fuqua says his House committee, which funds the shuttle program, will conduct its own investigation into the accident. He says, however, it will follow NASA's investigation and will not be aimed at placing blame. The world, as well as the nation this morning, is mourning the loss of the Challenger crew. A moment of silence was observed by the Canadian Parliament, the French Senate, and the European Parliament meeting in Strasbourg. In the Soviet Union, radio stations played American music. In Rome this morning, Pope John Paul praised the 7 crew members as courageous pioneers for human progress. Speaking to more than 5,000 people at the Vatican, the Pope said the tragedy has caused deep pain for people all over the world. In this country, President Reagan has declared a week of national mourning with flags flown at half-staff. And this morning on Wall Street, all systems are stopping and a moment of silence is being observed on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The crew of Challenger, like the crews of all the shuttle flights, trained for their mission at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. The city reveres the astronauts, and as Robert Elliott reports, the loss is felt deeply there.
The signs are everywhere, the flags are at half-staff. Throughout Houston, people are mourning the loss of 7 astronauts.
Take this moment of silence to think about them people that disappeared from the world today that was so tragic.
Astronauts are an important part of the Houston community. They're admired, respected, and often treated like heroes. Shuttle Commander Dick Scobie was no exception.
I do think that it takes a very special type of person to be an astronaut, and I think he fulfilled those special qualities.
Scobie was born and raised in Washington State. He loved airplanes, joined the Air Force, became a test pilot, and finally, in 1978, an astronaut. His hometown was thrilled with his success. Classmates, teachers, and coaches remember him fondly.
Interested in athletics, played football. Again, not an outstanding athlete, but a heart like you wouldn't believe.
Hey guy, we're going to give you a little picture. Scobie first went into space in 1984. Even then, his mother was apprehensive.
It's been fun, but it's been scary. I'm starting to have sleepless nights already.
Scobie saw the shuttle program as a dangerous and complex experiment and felt people were beginning to take its safety record for granted.
Each one of them is an individual technological marvel in itself, and you lose that by watching so many of them. There are a lot of things that go on during a space flight, and it's not easy to do, and it may look easy from the outside. It's not easy from the inside.
Robert Elliott, NBC News, Houston.
It's moving toward 8:07. Jane?
I don't suppose it's neither here nor there to most of the people at home, but I knew Dick Scobie. He was our associate during the, well, I'll call it the Sally Ride mission, 2.5 years ago. And he was a lovely, lovely man. Gentle and competent and cool and great guy.
Well, you know, we were just talking a minute ago, the years that I had in my freelance radio days, I worked for the space agency for 22 years. I did a lot of their radio work and got to work with the astronauts and many of the people connected with the program. And there is an esprit de corps and a love and an affection and dedication that's beyond description. And as you say this morning, we all have that terrible, terrible feeling of understanding and love and sympathy for the families. It's just,
you bet.
It's just unreal how we feel around this place this morning as we share with you. I have a couple of nice things, however. I want to show you a pretty lady. This is a beautiful lady. As a matter of fact, she's celebrating her 100th birthday today. Her name is Bertha Schneider, and she lives in Manteca, California. And as I say, she's 100 years old, and she's in great shape. There she sits in front of her birthday cake from last year.
She waited a long time for that birthday cake.
Do you think you'll make it? Do long livers run in your...
Surprise me.
You never know. You never know. More and more every year. Let's check the act this morning and see what we have. If you really want to have a really pleasant, and I mean enjoy some good weather, as far as temperatures are concerned, check out almost the entire state of Texas today. Houston is going to be 78 and all sunny skies, not mostly all sunny skies. Corpus Christi is going to be 80. Dallas-Fort Worth is going to be about 70. Our pick city of the day, however, is Roswell, New Mexico. And you ask, how did we arrive at that? Very simple. We haven't mentioned them on the air for at least 6 months, and they came through, and they are going to get a big shot on the show here. Roswell, New Mexico. Check it out, 72 degrees today. Couple of trouble spots this morning. Right here in the northwest, another storm system with rain. You might ask, so what's new? That'll translate to a few snow flurries in the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada range, somewhere around Lake Tahoe, and maybe even rain as far south as Los Angeles by this afternoon. San Diego, Phoenix, Tucson, Roswell, Dallas, Fort Worth, all across. New Orleans is going to be lovely today. Another cold blast is moving in from Canada. Only 9 degrees, Minneapolis, St. Paul. That'll be the high temperature. The big story, however, is this one. Low center just about here in Wisconsin will produce some snow. 2 to 4 inches in Chicago and Cleveland and Pittsburgh and New York City, Boston, Washington, Philadelphia. This whole system moving pretty much towards the northeast. The south is warming up. Miami, 64. Much milder and mostly sunny all day. Here's what's happening in your world this morning.
A traveler's advisory in effect this morning for snow and possible freezing rain. 1 or 2 inches of snow is possible with a high today of 34. Tonight's low at 32. Thursday's high 37.
A couple of quickie birthdays that I wanted to mention this morning. Eric Strom and Lillian Errett are celebrating their birthday today in Cupertino, California. He's 104 and she's 100. How about that? And Ethel Pinkston of Seattle, Washington. I think I mentioned her this morning. She's 100 years old. 8:09, and here's Jane.
Thank you, Willard. Up next on After 8, a look back at what our manned space flight program has been and a look ahead at where it might be going from here. But first, this is Today on NBC. On After 8 this morning, the past, the present, and the future of Americans in space. President Reagan observed in his speech yesterday that as a nation, we've grown used to space. It's hard to dazzle us, but that for the 25 years, the space program has been doing just that. In the following report, we see how.
Go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It was hard work and years of testing that led astronaut Alan Shepard to open the doors for Americans in space. He made a short suborbital flight in the space capsule Freedom 7, May 5th, 1961. Project Mercury was underway. John Glenn next became the first American in orbit, while many others, both American and Russian, followed. Soon, children across the globe would marvel over man's first walk in space, as you see here, made by astronaut Ed White. It was an awe-inspiring spectacle and unprecedented, and for President Kennedy, a commitment to the space program became top priority.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
And so we did, as our flag was planted on the moon's surface, and our men in space seemed, well, to be having fun.
I was rolling on the moon one day.
Space launches became so routine that, well, maybe people began to lose interest. And then in 1975, Americans and Soviets joined each other in space to shake hands over an extraordinary effort of international cooperation. For the next 6 years, the Soviets pretty much had space to themselves as the Apollo program went into hiatus. But in the spring of 1981, America launched the first space shuttle, Columbia, hoping to regain dominance in both research and exploration.
The space program in general and the shuttle program in particular gone a long way to help our country recapture its spirit of vitality and confidence. The pioneer spirit still flourishes in America. In the future, as in the past, our freedom, independence, and national well-being will be tied to new achievements, new discoveries, and pushing back new frontiers. We must never forget that the benefits we receive are due to our country's commitment made a decade ago to remain the world leader in space technology.
We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue.
Despite the president's firm commitment to the space program, questions remain about the future of the shuttle. Should the emphasis at NASA even be on manned space flight? In this time of budget deficits, is the shuttle cost really worth it? Joining us from the Johnson Space Center in Houston this morning is Gerald Griffin, who until 2 weeks ago was director of NASA's Johnson Space Center and who now is president of the Houston Chamber of Commerce. In our Washington studios is Alex Rowland, a former NASA employee who now teaches the history of technology at Duke University. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Good morning.
First, the very basic question, are manned space flights really worth the risk? Let's ask Mr. Rowland first to reply to that.
They may be in certain circumstances, but I think in the past we've put too much emphasis on them, and we have sent men and women up into space to do jobs that could be done more safely and more cheaply by machines.
Mr. Griffin?
Well, I disagree with that. The manned program, as Jane in her opening sequence there showed, has built step on step from Mercury to where we are today. The question is not one or the other, it's the proper mix, and I realize that's what Mr. Rowland is getting at, but I think that mix, which has been initiated in the executive branch, reviewed by the Congress annually, nobody's kept any secrets here, has been a matter of public policy, public issue, and it has been debated, and I believe we have the right mix today.
What about the unmanned space shots? Let's look now at the Voyager. Quite successful there, I would think. It has just passed Uranus. It's on its way now to Neptune. Doesn't that speak loudly in favor of unmanned space probes? Mr. Griffin?
Well, sure. I think to go to the outer planet in this day and age, that's probably the way we have to do it. Make no mistake, the Voyager spacecraft was sophisticated. To say that it was cost-effective is exactly right, but the booster that pushed it was also Titan Centaur, which is a very expensive vehicle in itself, and I don't quarrel with the idea that we should use unmanned technology where it fits. What I am saying, though, is that as this country is opening up the frontier of space, we're going to have to do it ultimately with men and women who will be very similar to how we open the American West.
You brought up the question of money, of cost of the space program. The shuttle program, as I understand it, is running about $14 or $15 billion in investment. Does the cost give you a problem, Mr. Rowland?
It surely does. We've put at least that much into development, and in fact, when it first flew in 1981, it wasn't up to specifications yet, and it's still being improved. That's more development money we're putting in. Additionally, because there is simply not the demand for spaceflight that was anticipated when shuttle was first designed, we continue to have to subsidize these flights. It costs the American taxpayer about $50 million in subsidy for each shuttle flight now, so we continue to add to that development cost with each flight.
Was the schedule a little bit too ambitious, do you think, Mr. Griffin? 15 shuttle flights planned for this year, trouble with the first one, Columbia, on January 12th, and of course the tragedy of yesterday?
No, John, the plans have, again, been built from the ground up. The flight rate scheduled for this year, before the events of yesterday, were well attainable. The system was designed to carry it out. And no, I think the schedule was right on. I'd like to react to something that Mr. Rowland said.
Please do.
Let's put the cost of the space program in perspective. Today, the total NASA budget is less than 1 cent of every federal dollar that's outlaid. In fact, it's something like 0.7%. And that's for all of NASA. That is for its aeronautics research, its space and applications research, its tracking and data systems, and manned spaceflight. Now, of that 0.7%, only about half of that, a little less than that, goes into what we call the manned spaceflight budget. But of that, only a portion is for the shuttle. Now, I'd like to hear a reaction from him that if less than half of a cent of every federal dollar outlaid is too much, what is enough then? I think that the American people certainly support the idea that at least something on that order in the federal tax system or the federal budget system is in order.
Like Mr. Griffin, I'm a supporter of the space program, and I think the amount that we invest in it is well spent. My only argument is that if we distributed that money more to machines within the program, we would get more for our dollar. That is, that manned space flight is too expensive for the returns we get on it. And if we took some of that manned money, we could do more things with machines than we're doing now.
Gentlemen, we have about a minute left. This tragedy yesterday, briefly, what does it mean, do you think, to the future of the space program in this country? Mr. Griffin?
Well, obviously, it's a setback that we have to deal with. At this point, obviously, our concern is for the families. That's going to take a while to work through that, but already people are working at trying to find the fix. I'm confident that the American space program will press on. It's not the first setback we've had.
Mr. Rowland?
I just hope that we get it together.
I agree, and I hope the space program does continue. And I hope we don't overreact to this tragedy, because this is just one of the inherent dangers in this kind of activity. I hope it doesn't result in major cutbacks to the rest of the NASA program.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. We'll be back in just a minute with more of our special coverage of the Challenger tragedy. First, This Is Today on NBC.
In the next half hour, we're going to look at an aspect of the shuttle tragedy that maybe you overlooked, or maybe you dealt with it in your own home yesterday. Should you turn off the TV or let the kids watch all they want? Kids are scared and confused and grieving too, and we'll talk with an expert about how to deal with it. Now a station break. And we're back at 8:30. I'm Jane Pauley with John Palmer and Willard Scott. Bryant is on vacation this week. Well, at schools all across the country, as well as at the Cape Canaveral launch site, there were a lot of children watching the space shuttle that would...
We interrupt this program for an NBC News special report. Here is Tom Brokaw.